Scientists put 5 monkeys in a room. In the center of that room is a ladder, and on top of that ladder is a bushel of bananas. Every time that one of the monkeys climbs the ladder, all of the other monkeys get sprayed with cold water, and soon they learn the association. So every time a monkey tries to climb the ladder, the other monkeys beat him up. Once they've learned this response, scientists start swapping monkeys in the room, one by one, for new monkeys who have never seen the spraying of the water, and they too try and climb the ladder, and they too get beat up, and after long enough, they have a population of 5 new monkeys, none of whom know why they don't climb the ladder, but nonetheless, none of them will climb the ladder. This experiment is really interesting. It also never happened. That story is really common. You will hear it in a lot of books on managing people, and you see it on LinkedIn all the time. And in fact, the only real experiment that was ever conducted to examine something similar found basically the opposite result in that study. They were using puffs of air instead of cold water, and they found that when they introduced new monkeys and they didn't receive the stimulus, then the old monkeys unlearned their fear response. And only once did the original monkey try and stop the new monkey from doing that, and he didn't do it by beating up the new monkey. Another very famous experiment, which you may have heard of, is the fleas in a jar experiment, where scientists took fleas in a jar and they capped the jar for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days, when they take the lid off the jar, none of the fleas will jump out of the jar. This also didn't ever happen. What I'm trying to illustrate here is a general rule that whenever you hear about some scientific experiment that very neatly and anecdotally wraps up some intuitive aspect of human psychology or behavior, it's probably not true. And the reason for this is that even true things become lies after long enough. But to understand why, we have to talk about the origin of the word meme. The word meme comes from Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and he specifically coins this word to sound similar to the word gene, because what he's trying to do here is come up with a similar concept to gene. Just as a gene is one unit of genetic information, he coins the term meme to mean a single unit of cultural transmission, an idea moving from one brain to the next. He says here, examples of memes are tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothing fashions, ways of making pots or building arches. Just as genes propagate themselves in a gene pool by leaping from body to body via sperms or eggs, so too do memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which, in the broad sense, can be called imitation. If a scientist hears or reads about a good idea, he passes it on to his colleagues and students. He mentions it in articles and in his lectures, and if the idea catches on, it is said to propagate itself, spreading from brain to brain. The idea here is that the way that information moves throughout people and cultures is kind of similar to the way in which gene mutations move throughout populations of organisms. The central idea behind how evolution works is that any gene mutation, which makes it so that that gene can spread more, either by increasing its ability to reproduce or increasing its ability to survive long enough to reproduce, means that that gene will make more copies of itself. This is very simple. Essentially, it's the idea that genes which spread farther, right? So the argument here is that something very similar happens with memes. You can start with a true idea, some real story or real experiment that's being told from person to person because it neatly illustrates some anecdote. But just like in a game of telephone, eventually one of the people telling this story is going to modify it just a little bit. They'll lie about the outcome or change their wording, and it's going to drift very slightly from the truth in what we might call a memetic mutation. But when this happens, it's going to make the idea stickier, because just as a gene mutates to become more replicable, a meme mutates to become more spreadable, easier to communicate, easier to condense. And so when this happens, ideas can start out as something that are true, but then they accumulate these mutations that make them false but more spreadable. And because they are more spreadable, more people will know them without knowing that they're false, and they will accumulate more and more of these false mutations until eventually we're left with something that spreads incredibly well but bears little resemblance to the truth. Another place that you hear these little lie stories all the time is in so-called folk etymology, stories that try to explain the origin of some particular word or phrase in the English language. One common one is the idea that the word posh, which refers to something kind of upper class, elegant, maybe a little stuffy, comes from the acronym Port Out Starboard Home, which refers to when ships were traveling between England and India, then wealthier passengers would prefer to have a cabin on the port side as they're leaving England, and on the starboard starboard side as they're coming home, because that side would be out of the sun and therefore a little cooler and a little more comfortable. And this sounds like a really great origin story. It perfectly explains how that would become associated with that. And the only problem is that, again, it's not true at all. There's zero evidence for this. In fact, we have evidence to the contrary. The reason that I'm telling you all this, not just so that I can debunk in this one video alone 3 lies that you might have believed, but that I want you to understand the process by which even true things become false when enough people talk about them, is because I want you to develop a kind of cognitive immune system for this stuff. Whenever you are having a conversation or reading something online and you are presented with some very clean, neat story that very clearly illustrates a specific concept in service of some bigger idea, that should raise red flags in your mind. And it should tell you that you ought not repeat that information until you have a chance to dig into it at least a little bit. It's not hard to debunk these things. Everything I talked about in this video, the fleas experiment, the monkeys experiment, and Posh, I was able to confirm were bullshit with less than a minute on Google. It's really not that hard. It's just annoying. It's a little extra work. But you got to ask yourself, would you rather be somebody who puts in the work or somebody who spreads the lie?